The moment a story stops being about headlines and starts becoming about identity, that is when everything changes, and right now, that shift is happening faster than anyone expected. What began as another wave of royal commentary has suddenly turned into something far more intense, pulling attention directly toward the most private part of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's lives, their children, and the questions now surrounding them. Because this time, the noise is not fading. It is growing. And at the center of it all is Tom Bower, a figure known for stepping into uncomfortable territory and asking questions that others avoid. And with his latest claims now circulating widely, the conversation has taken a sharp and unexpected turn. What makes this situation different is not just what is being said, but how quickly it is spreading, how deeply it is being discussed, and how strongly people are reacting on both sides. Suddenly, the focus is no longer on past interviews, royal duties, or media deals. It is on Archie and Lilibet. And that shift alone has changed the tone completely. Across social platforms, discussion panels, and media commentary, people are debating what is real, what is speculation, and what might have been misunderstood from the very beginning. Some are questioning timelines, others are revisiting old appearances, while many are simply trying to piece together a narrative that now feels more complicated than it once did. It is important to be clear about one thing. Many of the claims being discussed are not confirmed facts, but that has not slowed the momentum. In fact, the lack of clarity is exactly what is fueling the situation, because when answers feel incomplete, people start filling the gaps themselves, and that is exactly what is happening here. And then comes the reaction. Because while the conversation is getting louder, Meghan Markle is not staying silent in the way many expected. Instead, reports and commentary describe a very controlled and strategic response, one that is focused less on emotional reaction and more on precision. Legal teams, media responses, and carefully measured actions are all being mentioned as part of her approach, creating an image of someone who is not panicking, but managing. That contrast is what is catching attention. On one side, a growing storm of speculation. On the other, a response that appears calculated and steady. And right in the middle of that tension is Prince Harry, whose position is becoming more complicated by the day. Once widely seen as the royal who stepped away to protect his family, he is now being discussed in a very different light, with people questioning whether he is reacting, staying silent intentionally, or navigating a situation that is moving faster than anyone can control. That uncertainty is what keeps people watching. Because this is no longer just a story about public image. It is being framed as a story about truth, perception, and control. And the deeper this conversation goes, the more it pulls in past moments that once seemed insignificant. Old interviews, carefully presented appearances, and even small details are now being re-examined under a completely different lens. What once felt like polished storytelling is now, for some observers, being questioned in ways that were not happening before. That shift in perception is powerful. Because once people start looking back instead of forward, the narrative changes. And that is exactly where things stand right now. The Sussex image, built over years around themes of independence, honesty, and a fresh start, is now being tested under pressure from constant speculation and public debate. Supporters continue to defend their right to privacy, while critics argue that unanswered questions are what keep the story alive. And that divide is only getting stronger. Because every new discussion, every reaction, and every moment without a direct clarification adds another layer to a story that is already becoming difficult to ignore. But here is where it gets even more intense. This situation is not slowing down. It is accelerating. And as more voices join the conversation, the pressure is building not just on what is being said, but on what has not been said yet. Because in moments like this, silence does not stop the narrative. It reshapes it. And the longer that silence continues, the more unpredictable the direction becomes. Which brings us to the real question that is now quietly driving everything. If this continues to grow at this pace, who will step forward first and change the narrative? Because the answer to that might not just calm the situation. It could redefine it completely. The moment a story reaches the point where people stop asking what happened and start asking why hasn't it been addressed, the pressure shifts completely. And that is exactly where the situation is heading now, because the conversation is no longer just expanding, it is sharpening, becoming more focused, more detailed, and far more difficult to ignore. What is driving that intensity is not a single claim, but a pattern of questions that continue to circle back without clear resolution. Across platforms, one theme keeps repeating itself. If everything is simple, Why does it feel so complicated? That question alone is fueling endless debate, and it is pulling more people into the discussion every single day. Supporters continue to defend the right to privacy, pointing out that family life should never become public property, especially when children are involved. But critics are approaching it from a completely different angle, arguing that when a public narrative has been carefully presented over time, any gaps or inconsistencies naturally attract attention. And that tension between privacy and public curiosity is what is keeping this story alive. Because both sides believe they are right. Now, the spotlight is tightening around Prince Harry in a way that feels noticeably different from before. This is not the familiar criticism tied to royal disagreements or media deals. This feels more personal, more direct, and far more difficult to deflect. His identity as a father, something he has spoken about with clarity and emotion over the years, is now being pulled into a wider conversation that challenges perception itself. That shift is powerful. Because when a public figure builds their story around something deeply personal, any question surrounding that foundation changes how everything else is viewed. It is no longer just about headlines or reputation. It becomes about credibility, about whether the image presented matches what people believe to be true. And once that doubt enters the conversation, it spreads fast. At the same time, Meghan Markle is being positioned very differently in the narrative that is unfolding. The tone around her response is consistently described as controlled, strategic, and deliberate. There are ongoing discussions about legal teams, formal responses, and a firm approach to managing how information is presented and challenged. But here is where things become more complicated. Every strong response creates two interpretations. Supporters see it as protection, a clear effort to defend family boundaries and push back against what they view as harmful speculation. Critics, however, interpret the same actions as signals that the situation is more serious than it appears on the surface. And that split in perception is exactly what keeps the conversation growing, because each move, instead of closing the story, adds another layer to it. It becomes a cycle. The more the situation is managed, the more attention it seems to attract. And the more attention it attracts, the more questions people begin to ask. That cycle is extremely difficult to break once it gains momentum, and right now, it is moving faster than ever. People are not just reacting anymore. They are analyzing, comparing timelines, revisiting past moments, and connecting details that previously went unnoticed. Old appearances are being watched again. Past interviews are being reinterpreted. Even small details that once felt insignificant are now being treated as pieces of a much larger puzzle. And this is where the role of Tom Bower becomes impossible to ignore, because his claims are not being viewed in isolation. They are being layered on top of existing curiosity, existing skepticism, and existing public memory. That combination is what gives this story its momentum, because it feels less like a single event and more like a continuation of something that has been building quietly for a long time. Whether people agree with him or not does not actually slow the spread. If anything, it does the opposite. Because controversy creates engagement, and engagement keeps the narrative alive. But then comes the part that is adding even more pressure. The silence. Not just from Prince Harry and Meghan Markle on specific claims, but also from the wider royal circle, including figures like King Charles III and Prince William, whose absence from the conversation is being noticed more than ever. Because in situations like this, silence does not go unnoticed. It gets interpreted. Some see it as restraint, a deliberate choice to avoid fueling speculation further. Others see it as distance, a signal that there may be more happening behind the scenes than what is visible publicly. And again, both interpretations continue to exist at the same time, feeding into the same growing narrative. Now the conversation is reaching a point where it feels less like speculation and more like a standoff. On one side, a rapidly growing public discussion that refuses to slow down. On the other, a controlled and limited response that avoids directly engaging with the core questions being asked. And right in the middle of that tension is uncertainty. Because no one knows what happens next. Will there be a clear and direct response that addresses everything at once and resets the narrative completely? Or will the silence continue, allowing the speculation to evolve into something even more difficult to control over time? That uncertainty is what keeps people locked in. Because when a story feels unresolved, it creates a natural pull, a need to keep watching, to keep checking, to see what changes next. And right now, every new headline, every new discussion, and every new reaction feels like it could be the moment that shifts everything. But here is the deeper layer that is starting to emerge, and it is what makes this situation even more intense. This is no longer just about what is true or not true. It is about perception. Because in the public space, perception often becomes reality long before facts are confirmed or denied. Once a narrative gains traction, it starts shaping how people interpret everything that follows. Every action, every response, every moment of silence gets filtered through that perception. And changing that once it sets in is incredibly difficult. That is why the stakes feel higher now than they did at the beginning of this conversation. Because what started as scattered discussion has now evolved into a fully formed narrative that people are actively engaging with, debating, and spreading. And the longer it continues without a decisive shift, the stronger that narrative becomes. Which leads to the one question that is now quietly building behind everything else. Not just what is being said, but how long can this continue before something forces a turning point? Because if there is one thing history has shown about stories like this, it is that they do not stay in this uncertain middle ground forever. Eventually, something breaks. And when it does not just respond to the narrative. It changes it completely. The moment a story reaches the stage where people stop reacting and start anticipating what might come next, the dynamic shifts again. And that is exactly what is happening now, because this situation is no longer being followed casually. It is being watched closely, almost like everyone is waiting for a single move that could change everything at once. And the reason for that growing anticipation is simple. The narrative feels unfinished. Right now, there is no clear resolution, no defining statement, no moment that settles the conversation. And when that kind of gap exists in a high-profile story, it does not stay empty for long. Instead, it gets filled with theories, interpretations, and increasingly bold assumptions that begin to take on a life of their own. That is exactly what is happening here. Across discussions, one idea is starting to gain traction more than anything else, not because it has been confirmed, but because it represents what people feel is missing. Clarity. And in the absence of clarity, the conversation is evolving into something far more complex than it was at the beginning. It is no longer just about individual claims or isolated reactions. It is about how every piece of the story connects together, and whether those connections make sense to the people watching. That shift is subtle, but incredibly powerful. Because once people start trying to connect dots instead of simply reacting to headlines, the level of scrutiny increases dramatically. Now, the focus is tightening again around Prince Harry, but this time the tone feels heavier. The discussion is not just about his actions or decisions, but about his position within a narrative that seems to be moving without his direct input. Some portray him as someone caught in the middle, navigating a situation that has grown beyond control, while others suggest he is fully aware but choosing a specific approach. And that split in interpretation creates a difficult position, because both versions raise questions. If he is reacting, then people ask why there has not been a clear response yet. If he is choosing silence, then people ask what that silence is meant to achieve. Either way, the pressure does not decrease. It increases. At the same time, Meghan Markle continues to be described in a way that adds another layer to the situation. The dominant perception being discussed is one of control and strategy, where every move is calculated, every response measured, and every step designed to maintain a specific direction. But here is where things take a sharper turn. Because when a situation appears highly controlled, it can sometimes create the opposite reaction from the public. Instead of reassuring people, it can make them look even closer, searching for details that feel unsaid or unseen. That does not mean anything is hidden, but it changes how people interpret what they are being shown. And interpretation is everything in moments like this. Because once the audience starts questioning not just the story, but the way the story is being presented, the conversation becomes far more intense. That intensity is now spreading outward, pulling in more voices, more commentary, and more analysis from different angles. It is no longer limited to online discussions. It is moving into broader conversations where the stakes feel higher, where the implications are being framed in a much larger context. And that context brings attention back to the monarchy itself. Because while King Charles III and Prince William have not directly engaged with the situation, their presence is still being felt through absence. The lack of visible involvement is becoming part of the narrative, with people interpreting it in different ways depending on how they view the situation. Some see it as discipline and restraint. Others see it as distance. And once again, both interpretations continue to exist at the same time, feeding the same growing sense of uncertainty. But here is where the conversation takes another step forward. It starts to move from what is happening to what could happen next. Because as the discussion grows, so does the sense that this situation may eventually reach a point where a response is unavoidable. Not necessarily because of pressure alone, but because of how widely the conversation has spread and how deeply it is now being examined. At this stage, even small developments could have a major impact. A single statement, a carefully chosen interview, even a subtle shift in how things are presented publicly. Any one of those could redirect the entire narrative in a completely different direction. And that possibility is what is keeping attention locked in. Because people are no longer just following the story. They are waiting for the turning point. But here is the deeper layer that makes this even more complex. The longer a situation like this continues without a clear resolution, the more the narrative begins to stabilize on its own. Not necessarily around facts, but around perception. People start forming conclusions, even if those conclusions are based on incomplete information, simply because the absence of clarity creates space for interpretation. And once those perceptions settle, they become harder to change. That is the risk. Because even if a response comes later, it has to work against a narrative that may already feel established in the minds of the audience. It is not just about answering questions anymore. It becomes about reshaping how those questions are understood in the first place. And that is far more difficult. Which is why this moment feels so critical. Because right now, everything is still in motion. Nothing feels fully decided. Nothing feels completely fixed. The narrative is still shifting, still evolving, still open to change. But that window does not stay open forever. And that is exactly what makes this stage of the story so important. Because the next move, whether it comes from Prince Harry, Meghan Markle, or even indirectly through the wider royal environment, will not just add to the conversation. It will define it. And once that definition takes hold, everything that follows will be shaped by it. Which leads to the question that is now quietly building more pressure than anything else. Not whether people are watching, but whether the moment to change the narrative is already starting to slip away. The moment a story begins to feel like it is approaching a breaking point, where every new detail seems to carry more weight than the last, that is when the stakes rise in a way that cannot be ignored. And right now, this situation is moving directly into that phase, because the conversation is no longer just expanding or evolving, it is tightening, closing in on a point where something has to give. And what is making this stage different from everything before it is the growing sense that the narrative is no longer being shaped by one side alone. It is being shaped by momentum. Because once a story reaches this level of attention, it starts feeding itself. Every discussion leads to another, every interpretation creates a new angle, and every unanswered question becomes the foundation for the next wave of speculation. That cycle is now moving at full speed, and it is pulling in everything around it. Now, the focus is no longer just on what has been said. It is on what has not been clarified. And that distinction is critical. Because when people feel that key questions remain open, they do not simply wait for answers. They begin constructing their own conclusions, and those conclusions, whether accurate or not, start influencing how the entire situation is perceived. That is exactly what is happening now, and it is why the pressure feels heavier than ever. At the center of that pressure remains Prince Harry, whose position is becoming increasingly difficult to define. The narrative surrounding him is no longer consistent. Some portray him as someone caught in a situation that has grown beyond his control, while others suggest he is fully aware and choosing a deliberate path forward. And that dual perception creates a problem that is almost impossible to manage. Because no matter which version people believe, both raise the same underlying question. Why has there not been a moment that resets the narrative completely? That question continues to echo across discussions, and with every passing day, it becomes harder to ignore. At the same time, Meghan Markle remains at the center of a very different kind of interpretation. The dominant image being discussed is one of precision and control, where every move is intentional and every response is calculated. Reports and commentary continue to describe a strategy focused on legal positioning, structured communication, and maintaining a firm boundary between public speculation and private life. But here is where the tension deepens even further. Because the stronger that sense of control appears, the more it divides perception. For some, it reinforces the idea of strength and protection, a clear effort to defend family and push back against what they see as unfair scrutiny. For others, it creates the opposite reaction, a feeling that something is being managed too carefully, which leads them to question what might be missing from the public view. And once again, both interpretations exist at the same time. That is what keeps the situation unstable. Because there is no single narrative dominating the conversation. There are multiple narratives, all growing at once. Now, that instability is starting to extend beyond individual perception and into something much broader, the image of the monarchy itself. Even without direct involvement, figures like King Charles III and Prince William are being pulled into the discussion through absence alone. And that absence is becoming increasingly noticeable. In a system where symbolism and public presence have always played a major role, the lack of visible response is being interpreted in ways that go far beyond silence. Some view it as a deliberate choice to avoid escalating the situation, a strategy built on restraint and long-term thinking. Others see it as distance, a sign that the situation is being allowed to unfold without direct intervention. And once again, interpretation becomes reality in the eyes of the public. Because when people do not have clear answers, they look for signals. Even when those signals are subtle. Even when they are based on absence rather than action. That is why this stage feels so intense. Because everything is being read, analyzed, and interpreted in real time. But here is where the situation reaches another level entirely. The conversation is no longer just about the present. It is starting to look toward consequences. Because as the narrative grows stronger, people are beginning to ask what this could mean in the long term. Not just for public image, but for legacy, for trust, and for how this entire chapter will eventually be remembered. That shift changes everything. Because once a story moves into the territory of long-term impact, the urgency increases. It is no longer about managing headlines. It becomes about shaping how history itself will interpret what is happening right now. And that is a far more difficult challenge. Because history does not just look at what was said. It looks at what was done. It looks at what was addressed. And it looks at what was left unanswered. That is why this moment feels like a turning point. Because the narrative is reaching a level where continuing without a clear shift may allow it to settle into something permanent. Not necessarily because it is confirmed, but because it has been repeated, discussed, and reinforced enough to feel established. And once that happens, changing it becomes significantly harder. Now, everything seems to be narrowing toward a single idea. That this situation cannot remain in this uncertain state indefinitely. At some point, something will force movement. It could be a direct response. It could be a new development. Or it could simply be the weight of the narrative itself reaching a point where it can no longer sustain uncertainty. But one way or another, the current balance will not hold forever. And that is what is creating this growing sense of tension. Because everyone watching can feel that something is approaching. Not a small update. Not a minor clarification. But a moment that shifts the entire direction of the story. And when that moment comes, it will not just influence how this situation is seen in the present. It will define how it is remembered in the future. Which brings everything back to the same question that now carries more weight than ever before. Not whether the narrative will change, but who will take control of it when it finally does. The moment a story reaches the point where everything feels like it is balancing on the edge, where one decision, one statement, or even one unexpected reveal could shift the entire direction overnight, that is when it stops being just a conversation and starts becoming a defining chapter. And right now, that is exactly where the situation stands. Because after everything that has been said, questioned, analyzed, and debated, one reality is impossible to ignore. Nothing has been fully settled. And that uncertainty is what keeps the story alive. Every headline, every discussion, every reaction continues to circle back to the same core issue, not just what people believe, but what has not been clearly addressed in a way that brings closure. And as long as that gap exists, the narrative does not fade. It builds. Now the spotlight remains firmly on Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, not just as public figures, but as the central voices people are waiting to hear from. Because whether fair or not, the expectation has shifted. This is no longer a situation where silence is seen as neutral. It is being interpreted. And every moment without a direct response adds another layer to that interpretation. Some believe that maintaining privacy is the right approach, that no level of public pressure should force personal matters into the spotlight. Others argue that when a story reaches this scale, clarity becomes necessary to prevent speculation from turning into something more permanent. That divide is what makes this moment so powerful, because there is no single expectation. There are two completely different perspectives, both growing stronger at the same time. And right in the middle of that tension is the question of control. Who controls the narrative from here? Because up until now, the story has largely been driven by outside voices, commentary, analysis, and constant discussion. But that does not last forever. At some point, the direction shifts, either through a decisive response or through the narrative solidifying on its own. And that is the risk. Because if the narrative settles without a clear intervention, it can become the version people remember, regardless of whether it was ever confirmed or not. That is how public perception works. It does not wait. It forms, evolves, and eventually stabilizes. And once it stabilizes, changing it becomes one of the hardest things to do. At the same time, the wider royal environment continues to play a silent but powerful role. Figures like King Charles III and Prince William remain part of the conversation, even without direct involvement, because their absence is being read just as closely as any statement would be. Some see that silence as strength, others see it as distance. But either way, it adds weight to the overall narrative. Because in a system built on visibility, even the smallest absence can feel significant. Now everything seems to be converging toward a single turning point. Not a slow shift. Not a gradual change. But a defining moment that will either bring clarity or allow the speculation to continue shaping the story long term. And that is why the attention has not dropped. If anything, it has intensified. Because people are no longer just watching what is happening. They are waiting for what happens next. Will there be a moment where everything is addressed directly, resetting the narrative and closing the gap between speculation and clarity? Or will the silence continue, allowing the story to evolve into something that becomes harder and harder to control over time? That is the uncertainty that is holding attention right now. Because both paths lead to completely different outcomes. One brings resolution. The other extends the tension. And the longer that decision takes, the more the balance begins to shift on its own. Which brings this entire situation to its most important point. This is no longer just about headlines, rumors, or reactions. It is about legacy. Because how this moment is handled, whether through action or inaction, will shape how this chapter is remembered long after the noise fades. It will influence how people look back, not just at what was said, but at how it was managed when the pressure was at its highest. And that is what makes this moment so critical. Because moments like this do not repeat themselves. They define everything that comes after. Now here is where you come in. Because this is one of those rare situations where the story is not just unfolding in front of people, it is being shaped by the conversations happening around it. What do you think is really going on here? Do you believe this is simply a case of speculation growing out of control, driven by curiosity and amplified by constant discussion? Or do you think there are too many unanswered questions for people to simply ignore? And more importantly, should Prince Harry and Meghan Markle step forward and address everything directly? Or do they have every right to maintain their privacy no matter how loud the conversation becomes? There is no single correct answer here, and that is exactly why this discussion is so divided. Drop your thoughts in the comments right now, because every perspective adds to the bigger picture, and this is one of those moments where opinions truly shape the narrative. If you made it this far, make sure you hit the like button, because it helps push this conversation to more people who are following this story closely. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss what happens next, because if anything changes, and it likely will, you will want to see it the moment it happens. And share this video with anyone who has been talking about this situation, because the more perspectives that come in, the clearer the overall picture becomes. Because one thing is certain, this story is not over. In fact, it feels like it is just reaching the moment where everything could change. And when that moment arrives, it will not just answer questions. It will redefine everything.